Good morning. My name is Tony Fleo, and I serve as the CEO of Social Venture Partners Dallas. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Respond series, Texas Responds. As you know, here in Dallas, we have been doing these Respond series for the last several months since the pandemic and through the racial reckonings that we have experienced not only in our local communities, but across the nation and across the world. Today, I am pleased to be working with a more statewide audience because of our relationship with the Texas Tribune. Every year, Social Venture Partners, which is an organization made up of engaged men and women who bring their time, their talent, and their financial resources to the work of the community in support of the organizations that are on the front lines serving the needs of our community. Each year, here in Dallas, regionally, we hold a conference, a social impact conference called bigBANG. This year, SVP Dallas is proud to have the Texas Tribune as a media partner of bigBANG 2020. CEO Evan Smith of the Texas Tribune moderated a panel for us at bigBANG last year and experienced firsthand the depth and breadth of our annual social impact conference. As the Texas Tribune is focused on informing Texans and engaging with them about public policy, politics, government, and statewide issues, we felt that this year of all years was the time to take bigBANG to a statewide audience. Between October 26th and the 30th, we will be engaging people from across the state with a focus on really important, actionable solutions around social issues, particularly around the issues of racism, gender, and economic inequities. Social Venture Partners is an international network, and I want to give a shout out to our sister organization, Mission Capital in Austin, and our sister organization, SVP San Antonio. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to our presentation today. I am especially grateful to Bank of America, who is our statewide sponsor for bigBANG and today's presenting sponsor of this important conversation. Bank of America knows the private industry must initiate efforts and support local governments and nonprofits to address the health and humanitarian crisis and the very real consequences of systemic racism. We welcome Nikki Graham to say a few words to our audience, to talk a little bit about her role at Bank of America and the work that Bank of America is doing. Welcome, Nikki.
Great, thanks so much, Tony. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, my name's Nikki Graham. I'm the market president for Bank of America here in Austin, Texas. And I'd like to welcome you today to Texas Responds. As Tony mentioned, the pandemic and resulting economic insecurity, coupled with the spotlight on racial inequity, has challenged cities across Texas and across our nation. And local leadership in cities and business has never been more critical. That's why I'm absolutely grateful for SVP for putting together today's panel so that we can hear from the experts and what they're doing, and such a valuable conversation. The response and support takes the whole community, as Tony mentioned. It takes government, business, and local citizens to respond. And businesses are stepping up to do their part in multiple ways. Some of you may know that in June, Bank of America launched a $1 billion four-year commitment to address racial inequity and economic opportunity. And we're focused in a few key areas. And those include upskilling and reskilling for the job market, addressing the effects of the crisis on underserved communities, and making equity investments in minority depository institutions and Black and Hispanic-owned businesses. In addition, across Texas, my colleagues have deployed $6.5 million in immediate philanthropic and COVID response to help our nonprofit partners survive during this crisis. Those resources went to help testing, food distribution, education and mental health resources, and to support small businesses. We even moved our city's summer jobs programs and our student leaders programs, which are paid internships for young people. We moved those to a virtual environment. We've also purchased and deployed 10 million PPE masks across the country, with 1 million of those coming to support Texans. We've distributed those to childcare workers, small business owners, and to families so that they can help protect their loved ones. As we work collectively to meet the needs of Texas during this time, it's so critical that we continue to partner to do the most good. That's why I'm eager to hear today's discussion that Tony will moderate. And with that, Tony, just appreciate being part of this partnership, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate everything that you're doing, Nikki, and we appreciate the work of Bank of America here, not only in our cities, but statewide. So I'd like to introduce our panel today, all serving as city managers, and I would like to start with Erik Walsh. Erik is the city manager of San Antonio, the nation's 7th largest city. Is the chief executive officer of the municipal corporation. Mr. Walsh oversees 13,000 employees, manages an annual operating capital budget of $2.8 billion, and serves 1.5 million residents. Mr. Walsh has been serving San Antonio in that capacity since March 1st, 2019. My next panelist is Spencer Cronk, who is the city manager for Austin, Texas, where he is responsible for overseeing 14,000 employees and a $4 billion budget. Mr. Cronk also has served as chair in Minnesota Public Data Governance Advisory Committee, and I mention that because we may want to chat a bit about data and the role that it plays in city government. Austin ranks as the 11th of the largest cities in America, and Mr. Cronk, we welcome you to our panel today. We're especially grateful to TC Broadnax for his work that he does here locally in the city of Dallas. Since 2017, Mr. Broadnax has been the city manager for Dallas and is responsible for over 13,000 employees. He manages a budget of more than $3.8 billion. Dallas has a population of 1.3 million people and is the 9th largest city in America. It is my distinct pleasure always to welcome Kimberly O'Neill, who is an award-winning professor, executive leader, and social good expert who served as the youngest African-American female city manager in the United States. Kimberly now serves as the chief executive officer of Giving Blueprint, a company focused on increasing community and business development opportunities through philanthropy, policy, advocacy, and education. And most importantly, Kimberly is a partner with Social Venture Partners and serves on our board of directors. So we are grateful to each of you for giving us your time today. Mr. Broadnax, I'd like to start with you since we're here local in Dallas. In a recent conversation that the Texas Tribune hosted with city mayors, Mayor Erik Johnson, the mayor here in Dallas, said he wished that residents were better educated in what the different levels of government are responsible for. I'm hoping that you might share with us a little bit about just how the government situation works in a strong mayor system versus a city manager, city council system. Will you give us the crash freshman course in civics to get our audience all thinking in the right direction?
Well, thank you, Tony. And I appreciate the question. And we've had this conversation play out in our community, particularly around whether it's not strong mayor versus city manager form of government, but just the delegated responsibilities of state, county, city, and federal government in some cases around the types of services, who funds those services, and who's expected to deal with the challenges around the residents' expectations of local government. But to get to the specific question around mayor council form versus city manager form or council manager form of government, quite simply, the mayor council form of government requires and or expects that the mayor is elected at large by the entire population, and that they will then be responsible for the day-to-day operations of a city. And they not just serve as a policymaker, but also the executive that runs and facilitates all of the policies supported by the council. In some cases, those mayors have veto authority over certain council actions, but they are seen as the head of the political body as well as the administrative branch. In a council manager form of government, that's different. The voters elect council members as well as the mayor, but they then hire a professional executive to then run and serve as the CEO. They serve as the board, so to speak, if it was a private company, and they hire a CEO or an administrator to handle the implementation of policies and supervise and hire, fire, and handle purchasing for the entire organization. And so in the city of Dallas, similar to Austin and San Antonio, the council manager form of government is the government that Dallas has chosen. And the council, all 15 of them, inclusive of the mayor, hired me to run the day-to-day operations. And I work with them as well as the community to give a much more, in my opinion, balanced and equitable approach to how each one of those particular council districts are served, as I am responsible for and beholden to the full city council. They can hire and fire me based on my performance and or actions, different in some cases, obviously in all cases, from a strong mayor form of government, should that elected official not have any experience and or not be trained in administration, and people are not happy with their performance, they would still remain in office unless, of course, there was some type of election or recall to change mayors. And so again, that's the basic difference. And then the functions, as I talked about a lot earlier, where there's more clarity. Quite honestly, cities are responsible for the bulk of things that residents expect: police, fire, public works, libraries, and parks. And there is often no distinction or understanding that those different levels, whether funded or not, many of those things revolve around local government. So I hope that answered your question. And if there's any follow-up, I'm here, obviously, to be able to respond accordingly.
It does. I appreciate it. And just because the pandemic and, of course, the police issues are so prevalent, it is the city manager's role to hire the chief of police. Is that correct?
It is.
Thank you. And it is also the county's role to manage public health, not the city's. Is that correct?
In the city of Dallas, that is the case. We do not have our own health department. We contract with the county as our health authority. And I know that's a little different, I believe, in San Antonio. So specific to Dallas, we contract with the county to provide that service.
I see. Thank you. Mr. Cronk, I want to turn my attention to you. We chatted a bit in our pre-call about this issue. You are closest to state government there in Austin, and you can pick up the paper at any given moment and see that there is often tensions between state government and city government, and sometimes the state government seems openly hostile to city government. And I know that in the pandemic, you all were making on-the-fly decisions in your local communities very quickly. Talk about how when the pandemic hit that you all were making decisions about what to do for the public good and for the citizens that you are closest to, and how that got played out in your own area, and then possibly how the conflicts between leadership, both from national, state, city, made that more complicated. Can you chat a little bit about how you all responded to that?
Of course, first of all, thanks, Tony, for having me, and it's an honor to be among distinguished guests that you have on this panel. It is not uncommon for the state of Texas to go through emergencies or disasters, whether they be natural disasters, a flooding, a hurricane, and the pandemic is a different version of that. But ultimately, what we did see is a continuation of incredible efforts that came in collaboration and working together, both city, state, and county. And so as we have a history and record of that in the past, we were also seeing that in the early stages of this pandemic as well. Unlike Dallas, the city of Austin does have authority over its health department. And so we as a city worked closely with our county partners to ensure that we were standing up our emergency operations center and having our health officials work to ensure that we were doing everything we needed to do to address the very unexpected turns and events that we had in these early stages of the pandemic. But to your question, you know, it was important that we had good relationships with our state partners as well. And what I will say is that there was a lot of common messaging around what needed to happen. The use of social distancing, you know, washing your hands, making sure you were covering your face when you coughed, ensuring that you stayed home when you were sick. And then also the face coverings. I think that was certainly something that brought a lot of attention. And we saw that initially cities and counties were really in front of trying to encourage everyone in their community to use the use of face masks, face coverings. And we got the same messages from our state partners and the governor as well. And so we know that even though it is important for all those messages to be coherent and collaborative, it is even more impactful when they are unified. And so when the governor issued the mandates on July 2nd for face coverings, it really allowed the entire state to be unified in that respect. It was a hard decision, I'm sure, for him, but it didn't have this patchwork of different policies and practices across the states, across the cities. I could have imagined another scenario where different cities were doing something and that might not have been as impactful as if it wasn't a overarching strategy from the state. So we continue to see that strong partnership. We rely on that. And even though the city of Austin and the state of Texas from a policymaker have a history of you know, differences and differences of opinions, often in times of crisis, we do make sure that we're all coming together, and that is certainly evidenced through this pandemic.
And how are the numbers in Austin looking? Are you all headed in the right direction?
We are, and we're getting an update from our health authority right now with our city council, and we have seen the numbers not just drop but plateau, and so we are looking positive. But as we continue to message, it is important that we don't let up. Especially as students are coming back to school, as we see people getting a little more anxious to want to hang out together and maybe relax their standards a little bit. We continue to put that pressure on to make sure that those standards of face coverings, social distancing are adhered to.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh, the Texas Tribune did a conversation with the mayors, as I alluded to before, and Betsy Price, the mayor of our neighbor here in Dallas and Fort Worth, was on, and she said in response to the question about state leadership, she said, "We represent the same people in Texas as you do," as if she were speaking to the state legislators. And she said, "But we are closer to them." What she said is really true. People do engage with their cities, their city council person, their mayor, much more than they do with the state level officials. My three guests today, you have lived in the city that you manage your entire life and have served your city in various roles throughout the years before reaching the level that you have reached. What is the tension there? Is it your job to listen to the citizens and really respond to what they have to say? Or is it your job to listen to council and their priorities? When you have such deep roots in a city and strong relationships, how do you manage those relationships?
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel today. You know, as TC described, I mean, I've got 11 bosses, a mayor and 10 council members that hired me and that I work for, and so obviously making sure that I'm in tune with the priorities of the council is key. But I'll say that it's also important to make sure that you're hearing from the community, and I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a balance that has to be struck, and there are, even before the pandemic, I can think of a number of issues where, you know, it's really key for the city to be able to share an issue with the community and get feedback. I'll also add in there that it's important to me, and probably any other leader of a large organization, to also get a fair amount of feedback from the employees, because there are things that we're dealing with every day that impact, in San Antonio's case, 1.5 million people every day. And what Mayor Price said is that, you know, everybody in San Antonio today touched the city somehow or another. We either picked up their garbage or their recycling, they drove a city street, they were at traffic signals, they may have unfortunately had to call 911 because of a traffic accident. And so we are closer at the ground level, and I think that's probably a little bit more of a practical experience that people have. It also creates those pressure situations, especially in an emergency, where the public has that expectation that local government will help. And so I think it's a balance from a city manager's perspective. You have to be able to engage that. And to your point, Tony, I've got on my mom's side of the family a relatively large family, and so you know there's a lot of pressure. I'd say from my standpoint, because I think it's a little unusual to be city manager in your hometown. And you know, city manager is a mobile profession. As I came out of graduate school 26 years ago, I don't think I would have envisioned myself with the same organization. So I'll tell you that personally, I think it's an added level of pressure for me, because I want the best for San Antonio, and I want the organization to be better off at the end of my tenure, and continue to do what's needed here for the community.
Thank you. Kimberly, you know, we have you joining us today, and I am grateful because you have expertise in all of these areas. But you know, you're talking here, bigBANG. One of our priorities for bigBANG is to talk about gender equity, and you are talking to 3 men who are leading big cities. Are they doing okay? What would you like them to know? Any reactions to anything that they've said so far? This is your chance now to tell them how the cow ate the cabbage. So go for it.
Yeah, so you know, I'm honored to be with them today. This is the first time I left working in city government 10 years ago, and this pandemic is the first time that I actually miss being in a decision-making role, because I know that it's not easy, and leadership is tough. And so when it comes to gender equity, I remember my experiences as a city manager, and the challenges that I had as not only a woman, but a young woman in that role. And one of the things that we do see in city government is we are seeing that there are women climbing the ranks and running cities throughout the country. And so I don't have a lot to add onto that part, but what I do want to really speak to the people that are watching today and kind of bring the 3 conversations so far to a point that local government is the most important part of government that touches you on a day-to-day basis. I'm a political science professor now as well, and I always start off my classes asking my students, who are your elected and appointed officials? Who are the people that are making those decisions for you on a day-to-day basis? Who do you hold accountable when something is or is not happening? When you wake up in the morning, think about everything that you do, from waking up, turning on your lights, turning on your water. Who's responsible for the authority and governing how that happens? And when you start thinking about that local government means way more to us than many of us think. We tend to blame what happens in Washington or on the state level, but sometimes we have to just turn it around and say, who is our city manager? And do we understand the differences between a mayor council form of government and a manager council form of government? And one other point that I really want to add is that although we're talking to city managers for 3 of the largest cities in the state of Texas, the majority of our cities throughout the state of Texas do operate on a manager council form of government, regardless of the size. And I think it's important to note for those that may not live in a larger city, that while your city may not be as large as San Antonio, Austin, or Dallas, your city manager still has the same level of authority and responsibility based on your city charter, which is the equivalent of a constitution that governs what's supposed to happen in the city. And so it's important that we really pay attention to what's happening, especially during times like this and how these decisions are being made. But I can say that as a former peer doing the same comparable type of work, that I'm proud of what's happening on the local government level and the decisions that our city managers are making. People don't, I sit in a very unique seat. And I do know what kind of decisions that they have to make. And when you're looking at the size governments that they're running, this is not an easy time, and the decisions that they're making are not easy at all. And so I think my comment right now is more complimentary than anything, because these are unprecedented times. Although we do have emergencies, this is an unprecedented time. And our cities are still operating, and that's what counts and matters the most right now.
Thank you, Kimberly, and that is very affirming. You know, I agree that I think our each of you are servant leaders at heart, and the vast majority of people who work for the citizens of their cities also have that same heart. But despite the heart, there are tough issues that have to be faced, and we have faced those with the racial reckonings in each of our cities. Mr. Cronk, would you talk a little bit about the policing and the budget concerns and our citizens being heard? Some citizens are very concerned about issues around what is defunding police, and other citizens are saying, look, you know, we've got to shift some funding to other organizations so the police don't have to go to these calls. Talk a little bit about how you all are handling that there in Austin.
Sure. No, appreciate this opening, because it is a critical conversation. The death of George Floyd in Minneapolis really laid to bear what many have known for a long time, that we have systemic inequities in our policing and law enforcement institutions here in the United States, and we have to do better. We have to make sure that we are interrupting them in ways that support all of our community. And so it is an important conversation that our city in Austin has been having. Right around the time of that, we were also in the middle of a budget adoption process. And so my staff was putting together our budget for the next year, and we needed to be responsive to what we were hearing from the community. Hundreds, thousands of people came out, not only to testify at budget hearings, but to email not only city staff, but our council members to talk about what their priorities were in this coming year's budget. What ultimately happened in August is something that we should take some time to clarify, because I think people throw around the words of defunding and abolishing without really having some of the nuance that is part of these important conversations. So the budget that our city council adopted in August did three things. One, it did take what we had projected in the police department's budget and reduced that by about $30 million, and redirected those monies, those resources, to other law enforcement or other ways in which we can address some of the safety issues in our community. And so they might be for mental health responders, they might be for our EMS, our emergency medical services, they might be even for violence prevention. So there were specific areas that those resources were redirected to with the budget adoption. Another piece of the budget was really moving into a placeholder category that said, here are some things that the city has historically placed in a police department's jurisdiction that may not need to be there long term. And so, for example, we have a forensics lab, and so some other communities, that forensics lab is not necessarily situated within the police department's authority. It may be still under the jurisdiction of the city the city itself, but it might report to the city manager or another individual within city government, or it might be outside of city government. So we're going to take those resources, those areas that have been identified, and have a year-long conversation around what future might those have going forward. Where might they be better situated so we can continue to build trust and have the important discussions that we needed with our community. Then there is another a chunk of resources, a bucket, if you will, that was put in a reimagining category that, again, are traditionally police functions, but may not need to be done by officers in the future. And so this is the more complicated area. We want to engage with our community members and with a broad set of stakeholders, including our police department, officers, and our police association, to talk about what that future is. And I'll give one example of park police. Many cities have officers that patrol their parks, and we want to have a discussion with both our stakeholders, our community members. Do those need to be officers in the future? What resources might be needed to have the important safety requirements and law enforcement ability that our current officers that patrol our parks have? And so that again will be a longer term discussion, but something that's really critical. To help facilitate this, I, as city manager, instituted a city community task force that's comprised primarily of individuals within our community that have been historically disproportionately impacted by law enforcement. And so I needed to make sure that their voices were at the center of this discussion. We're going to be including experts in the field in different areas as the work progresses, but that work is ongoing. It has just gotten started, but we really need to make sure that it's intentional and that we're able to sustain some of the recommendations that come forward. This isn't something that is just going to be a quick change. These are things that are long-standing, that need the thoughtfulness to be really allowing communities to reimagine what public safety looks like.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Walsh, I want to ask you about that reimagine that Spencer has talked about a bit. And, you know, students of systems and white privilege and racial injustice all understand that the enemy to this is the status quo, right? And maintaining the status quo has an awful lot of power. In that interview that the Texas Tribune did with the mayors, your mayor said that we have to stop policing poverty. The mayor of Houston further echoed that and said we have to invest in people. Many people who are already marginalized suffer the most when crises like COVID, civil unrest, and hurricanes hit. We have to divert more funding to those communities before the crisis occurs to strengthen them. How does that get, has your thinking changed on budget priorities and doing more preventative things now that we have experienced COVID and the racial reckonings that our cities have gone through?
Well, it has, and I think that's the pressure that cities probably all over this country feel themselves in because of the parallel universe of economic crisis. And Spencer said something a second ago. Some of these things don't change with a single budget process, and frankly, it requires a lot of prioritization from the policy leaders, the elected officials, but then more structural related changes. And I think in San Antonio we came up with a really, I think, very targeted relief effort with the utilizing our Corona relief funds we received from the federal government that focused in 4 main areas, and rather than try to prioritize everything, the staff and the council prioritized 4 areas: workforce development, housing security, small and micro business grants and assistance, and digital inclusion, and not digital inclusion open-ended, but directly working with the independent school districts here in town and ask them, prioritize where you had the biggest challenge connecting to kids during remote learning last spring. And the reality is there's certainly private providers that have service, and the school districts identified 50 neighborhoods, and we're utilizing our own fiber network in San Antonio that connects all of our traffic signals, and looking to create for lack of a better term, a wireless network by neighborhood, just targeted in those areas where there was connectivity issues. And you know, I think that probably from a long-term perspective, making targeted investments in those areas of town that have pre-pandemic saw the impact. I think everybody knew what zip codes in San Antonio had disparate health statistics, and we've seen that amplified through the pandemic. And there's no end in sight. So how are we going to kind of redirect funding or new funding to programs? And Tony, I don't think that's something that we fix in 12 months or 24 months. We're talking about systemic changes in investment over a long term, over an individual's life. And I think one of the things that I think we've seen here locally over the last 6 or 7 months is the city working really closely with the county. The city, so San Antonio has the health department responsibility, and there's a hospital district that is really underneath the county. So we've got the upstream preventative care under the health department, and then we've got the healthcare portion with the county, and we've done a really, I think we had a really good relationship before. I think it's strengthened now, and the sort of conversations we're having now is how do we start to change that direction over the long term? And it's going to require a lot of work and a lot of consistency and very targeted approach year after year. It's not something we solve in one budget. It can't. Those things. The thing that I worry about is, rushing to solve something and saying we solved it when all we did was maybe set aside a little bit of money. It didn't solve anything. And from my perspective, it's got to be permanent and something that we manage over time. And I think that's going to be the challenge that all of us are going to have. And it's the conversation the council's having right now as we go through our proposed budget process.
I appreciate hearing that, and I understand that these things, of course, they take time. Mr. Broadnax, in the minds of those who live in marginalized and under-resourced communities, the time was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, right? For them, they can't wait another 2 years. Well, everybody figures it out and gets the right resources to those communities. And yet I have been very proud of the city of Dallas over the last several years because the city has created departments to work on racial equity, to work on economic equity, and the city had intentionally funded those departments to move in these directions over the years. Do you feel like they've been successful? Is there a commitment to keep that going? Is that the kind of thing that we need, or do we need a whole other shift in our understanding?
Well, Tony, I definitely believe that those type of intentional and guided offices are needed. And so I know our city council, as well as our community, and thank you for acknowledging some of the work that my team has been doing over the last few years. The council is very supportive, particularly as it relates to how these particular departments or offices can connect the dots that bring data-driven perspectives to the things that I think you, obviously being here in Dallas, understand have been systemic and historical as it relates to how Dallas has been segregated. I'm sorry, my lights are going out in my office. And so I do know specifically, I recall making the recommendation to create the Office of Welcoming Cities and Immigrant Affairs in March of 2017. That particular office has spent quite a bit of time investing time with immigrant populations in removing barriers, fighting fights, working with our city attorney's office and other offices and other outside stakeholders to ensure, again, those people in our community who might have a different status as it relates to citizenship are protected and receive services and are connected to our local government and how we go about doing our work here. In 2018, we actually established a new Office of Equity that is now entitled, obviously, the Office of Equity and Inclusion as a part of this year's budget. But they have focused on working with our entire workforce as well as the outside world to bring attention to the inequities. And Erik, City Manager in San Antonio hit it right on the head. There were a lot of things that you can hear about anecdotally, but that office, in concert and support with the City Council, we began to publish, beginning in 2018, equity indicators that would show and highlight and better understand the racial inequities built into many of our particular, whether it's policies and or things that are happening in our organization. And there were 5 fundamental areas that that equity indicator highlighted, and we've updated those in 2019, but they were the economic opportunity, there was education, there was neighborhood and infrastructure, there was justice, as well as government services, and then lastly, public health. And so you think about that in 2018 and the work put into those efforts and the support and the information that was provided to the community as well as our own elected officials. When you think about what those things touched on and where they showed up in our community, obviously, given the pandemic, as City Manager Walsh indicated, these things have been amplified, but we were ahead of with understanding of where these things would have that impact. And they've touched all of those areas, and we're working in each one of those spaces to try to find a way to make progress in those areas. So definitely, these areas and these offices are needed. I think they have council support. They have my support. I think as we look at what has occurred, whether it's the pandemic or the social unrest, I believe our focused and intentional investments, which is what many of the individuals who are out on our streets in a sustained manner have been marching for, given the connection between how we police our community and the impacts that that might have on certain different populations in our community. I am obviously committed. I know our chief, who obviously, as you may know, announced her resignation last week, has been committed, has been passionate and consistent, particularly around 21st century policing. I'm hopeful in our new chief that we have a similar person that have the same level of commitment. Actually, I will ensure that they have that level of commitment. We've got a lot more work to do. I think our offices are playing a role in framing the conversation, whether it's our budget, whether it's where we make investments. I'll be quite honest, I'm very proud of our mayor and city council. Every item we consider, particularly around budget, they always ask the question, how does that impact and affect certain types of communities that have less than? And we can share with them through the way we've looked at our budget and how we propose things, where those things show up as a benefit. And so again, I know I'm committed as long as I'm city manager. I'm hopeful we'll continue to have these offices doing this work because at the end of the day, our product is service, and we need to ensure that we are providing that service in an equitable manner, regardless of what zip code you're in, to ensure people at least have the same opportunities as everywhere to succeed and grow and thrive in this community.
Thank you, TC. You know, we are very grateful from Social Venture Partners' perspective that the City of Dallas is co-producing our Big Bang Conference on equity this year, as you did last year. And the folks that you hire that we interact with are just top-notch. And so congratulations on the hires that you have made and the work that they're doing in the community. Kimberly, as you listen to all of that, do you think it's too little too late? Or what's your opinion on the work that cities are doing around racial equity?
So I actually have notes. I've been taking notes. So there are some things that just as the climate's been changing, as I've been listening to the conversation, and there was actually a question that I asked of an elected official, I think earlier last week, and it starts with, how deep are we actually diving into data? And are we actually looking at the additional variables that are underneath? And one of the questions that always comes up for me, I have a background in Inspector General work, so I did a lot of work around performance audits. And so when I think about recruitment, when I think about gender equity, but when I think about the socioeconomic impact of recruitment and equity as well, I always ask, well, how many people from that particular city are on the police force, are on our residents that are on in the fire department, that are actual employees on the civilian side of government work. And no one can ever give me that number. And I think it's important to know that number because it speaks to what types of recruitment issues you might be having. And so I would just encourage not just the city managers that are here today, but anyone that's responsible for addressing equity issues, especially as it relates to gender and race, that it is important for you to know if you have 35% of an entire workforce that are residents of the city, because if it's 35% or 40% and you don't see this higher number, it could speak to some of the challenges that you're having as it relates to output and perceptions across the city as well. And so I just encourage everybody to really look at those numbers of your new incoming recruits and trainees. What percentage of those are city residents? And if they are not, vast majority are not, why is that happening? Some of the things when it comes to police officers that I've pointed out is that, over the past few decades, we've seen this call for some college credit, whether it be, 30, 60, a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree. And a lot of people say, I remember hearing a chief in the past encouraging residents to actually apply for the vacant police officer positions. And I remember saying, they can't afford to go to college, right? So if we know that there's a barrier for entry for certain people, how do we make sure that there's access to college so that residents can apply if that is their only barrier to getting into a police force? So that would be number one. Number two is that I would really like to see that cities engage in some sort of internal performance audits, not just always contracting out, but just from the work that I used to do. I think it's really important that cities on an ongoing basis, not just when there's a problem, but that there's some sort of internal operation that pays attention to policies and processes and procedures and makes recommendations on how to do government better. Where are we excelling? Where do we have opportunity to improve? And where are we just putting too many resources in a particular area? And that helps to support budget changes as well. And the last one, which I think is something that I talk about quite often, is I think we underestimate what the nonprofit industry does in support of our cities. And if we really put a dollar value to their economic impact from how many staff members that they collectively have in a city, what kind of services they're providing, what do their budgets look like, because of their work, what does that take off of the city's responsibility? I think it's in time that cities, in addition to looking at chief innovation officers and all of these other positions, start looking at a chief service officer, that this one house that pays attention to the nonprofit community, brings them in, and so they truly are partners, and recognizing what that economic impact is in support of the city's work, because that to me can address some of the equity issues that we're seeing across the country, but specifically in Texas as well.
Thank you, Kimberly. That is really very helpful. And TC, I want to throw this back to you and piggyback off of a point that Kimberly made. A few of these response series ago, we had representatives of Ernst & Young on our panel, and they offered to do some pro bono consulting work to bring some of this data revelations to life, to partner with the city, to partner with the county, and as did Social Venture Partners. And we really found very difficult to kind of provide those services to the cities and to the county that companies want to bring with their expertise to you all. Is there a way to navigate those kinds of things that is not so complicated, so that those who want to provide those kinds of services, even pro bono services to cities and to local government, how do they interface? How can they get in there and actually be heard by the city leadership?
I think that's something that a lot of cities have struggled with, and I think we struggle internally ensuring that people, as I say, are connecting the dots and figuring out where certain types of advances can be made. And that is even more difficult with externalities, particularly given the limited bandwidth in some cases of our respective departments and what their current work programs are. And as you know, in many cases, some people take the opinion, do I need another issue, another thing to challenge, another data point to have to track? And then will there be political support for it? I will tell you, I have made it a mission in how I approach leading organizations to be more inclusive as it relates to welcoming partnerships, stakeholder engagement, outside resources, obviously whether nonprofit, philanthropic, and or the private sector, on how do we collectively work to make the community better. And if you've got an idea, if you've got a service or something that you can and are willing to provide, it's really my fundamental duty to ensure that I find a way to make sure that, one, you get an ear, but also that whatever you're proposing that might actually benefit our residents is given a fair opportunity to figure out whether or not the city can coalesce. And I think our city councils expect that. And so I would say to you, the best way to ensure that you have that type of engagement is, particularly as we're structured here, and I'm sure Spencer and Erik are structured similarly, really make that initial contact with our key executives as it relates to our assistant city managers or any chief of a certain area, to begin that dialogue, because I found that my particular assistant city managers and chiefs are very interested in how do we reach people who may not be on our radar. And so I think that is the first way to do that. And then ultimately that comes and gets in front of me. And then it's my job to work not just with my team, but the external organization to figure out how do I connect that back with the policy objectives of our city council and get them interested in it. And so again, I would say you have to start in some cases at the top. And even if you're working with someone that is in the field or down in the trenches with you, figure out how you get an audience or help them feel empowered enough to at least make the handoff, to move it up the chain, because I agree, it's about intentionality, and it's about the leveraging of executive resources to empower and share with your employees that we can all work together, and we need to figure out how to navigate the waters. But it's ultimately my responsibility and the people that work directly for me to ensure that everybody's got an equal place at the table and can share their benefits with the city.
In the last few minutes that we have, I'd like each of you to just share with those final, everybody has a place at the table comments. You know, not only are you worried and your priority is about the citizens and delivering services to the citizens, but you are CEOs of major organizations with thousands of employees. Erik, how do you make sure within your own employees and the own organization that you're running that you are paying attention to equity and you are inviting people into powerful positions that don't look like you, that have different perspectives than you? What are your initiatives around how you accomplish that?
Thanks, Tony. Before the pandemic, it's making sure that you are surrounding yourself with leaders who have a wide range of backgrounds and are diverse. And you know, I think that's key probably in any organization. I think we've got an executive core here at the city that, as Kimberly described, is reflective more so than the rest of the community, and that's been a very deliberate attempt on my part. And more importantly, I would say we have a really good team here in San Antonio, and we've seen that team stressed over the last 7 months, and seen the strength of that team. I will also say that with the killing of George Floyd at the end of May, you know, as we went through the pandemic, I got into the habit of sending an email out to all 12,500 employees at the end of Friday, and sometimes the email was you know, 2 lines: keep your head up, keep moving, great job, you know, I'll keep you informed. And it's become routine for me now. And in early June, in the Friday email, I sent out a conversation about racial inequity and justice and the killing of George Floyd. And I'll tell you that I was taken aback by the response I got to the email. from all kinds of employees. And we have created a Black affinity group here in San Antonio. I asked one of our assistant city managers and several other African American executives to lead it, and we're having that conversation throughout the summer. And I've had that conversation directly with them, and I think it's important to get the perspective. But as I said earlier, it's not about having a Zoom WebEx with 400 employees. It's about what happens after that, next week, next month, next year, and engaging in that conversation from an organizational perspective. And that's where the work really happens. And I'm thankful that we've got a team that is reflective of the community here and is really strong.
Appreciate that. Spencer, how about you? How have you integrated this? How have you changed? We just have a few minutes left. How has the last 7 months changed you and the way you work with your teams?
I think one thing, and this was highlighted earlier, about just the need for transparency and the need to make sure that that line of communication was open with all of our both staff and then the community and our different stakeholders. And so how do we as leaders open that line of communication, as Manager Walsh said, with just frequent emails? How do we make sure that we are being authentic around what those discrepancies, disparities are within our communities, and that what we're doing about that? And so the need for transparency has just been highlighted. You know, you can't hide behind a computer, even though we're in this virtual environment. We have to make sure that we are being honest and authentic about what those conditions are for our community.
TC, how have you been changed by the last several months?
You know, Tony, I think similar to Erik and Spencer, I'd say these last several months, 7 months, inclusive pandemic, as well as the civil unrest related to George Floyd, has really allowed me to better understand, I think, the intentionality of our city when it came to us establishing and creating resilient Dallas. How does a community respond to and get out of and be better when there are on the other side of some shock to our organization, whether health related and or natural disaster, but in this case, in some cases, the civil unrest and the racial, I think, issues and challenges that have been happening in other communities that happen here, but are amplified. And I will tell you, we have really become more intentional and purpose-driven around implementing the framework of that resilient strategy and the actions, whether related to our police reforms and the immediate things that we have been doing there that we've entitled Real Change, and or the actionable things around the non-law enforcement related activities that we're entitled Real Action. Speaks to Erik's statement about being intentional, but being committed and investing and continuing to invest to find ways to move the needle across all the issues that have been discussed in this community for many, many years, but making those things really show up in our actions. And so I think to you, it's only hardened my belief that one, our community is resilient, but two, that we've got a lot more work to do. And my team, as Erik talked about his team, I think my team is up to the task. I think I have a great team. They do reflect this community and they're committed to this community. And I'm excited to roll up my sleeves and continue the heavy lifting along with our mayor and city council to again allow people in this community to live their lives here, prosper here, and have their kids do the same.
Thank you, TC. Kimberly, any closing thoughts for our panelists, or just any thoughts that you have about how it's changed you these last few months?
Well, it's impacting me, as you know, it's impacting me personally, just the pandemic, and just thinking about how this translates back to government. You know, everybody's working hard, from our executive leaders all the way down. And I just think it's important for everybody to remember just the weight of responsibility from your rank and file staff all the way up and what that really means. Leaders are going to lead, but I also think it's important for everybody to remember that the leaders also have to be able to invest in their people all the way down. That everybody has a goal, and that we also need to make sure that every single employee is able to get to the point that they're trying to get to. And that too is the city's responsibility, not just to the residents, but also to the people that have made this work, this entire thing work over the past 7 months. Don't forget them.
You know, to each of you, I am just very grateful for the service that you provide to your communities. It has been a privilege to get to know those of you who are representing other cities other than Dallas. And so I'm grateful that you carved out the time to join me and to join with the Texas Tribune in presenting this conversation. We know this time has been extraordinary, and you each seem to have risen to the occasion extremely well. And so I am grateful to you and to your teams for your service. Kimberly, I'm always grateful to have you and your expertise on my side. Thank you for being a social venture partner with us and your board service to Social Venture Partners Dallas. In terms of leadership, we could not be more grateful to Bank of America and to Nikki for representing them today, and for your ongoing support of our work around gender, racial, and economic equity that we will be showcasing at the end of October with bigBANG Conference. And so I invite all of our audience to join us again for these series and to follow our website so that you too can be a part of these conversations, but more importantly, so that we can be a part of the actions that make significant and real change. I'd like to thank our ongoing sponsors as well, Wright Knatzer, Something Good Consulting, Forward DFW, and most importantly, I want to thank my small but mighty team at SVP for making these things work, to our board of directors, and to all the partners at Social Venture Partners throughout Social Venture Partners International, and particularly throughout the state, who bring their time, talent, and financial resources to make our community a better place each and every day. Once again, my gratitude to the panelists and to you, Kimberly. I appreciate all of your time and your service that you bring. Thank you so much. Take care.